Well, thank you very much. I appreciate that. So, wanted to start out here, if I could, by sharing a little bit more about myself before we actually go into the presentation proper. So, I've been doing system implementations for over 35 years. As was stated, I'm a vice president of our Strategic Technology Solutions Group in Avaap. It's 30 years of ERP experience across Banner, Infor, Lawson, Oracle Cloud, PeopleSoft, and Workday. And one of the things that my clients typically like is that I've had 13 years of CIO experience as well. So I'm not only a consultant, but I actually have sat on the other side of the fence, so to speak, and been on the client side of engagements as well. So I think that combination hopefully gives me a little bit of credibility as we go through the content today. Again, I won't read the entire slide here, but that's me in a nutshell. All right, so let's go ahead and move forward. Um, Before we get in the content about our software selection approach, we wanted to give a short overview of Avaap and who we are. Again, there's only one slide here, so we won't take a lot of time on this. But one of the things we did want to show is that we have a significant amount of experience in information technology and technology type implementations. And again, this is around a number of different systems that we support and we implement. But again, some of the core competencies that we have is project management, is a change management. Again, today we're talking about strategic technology solutions like software selections and feasibility studies and IT strategies and that type of thing. We have a very robust organizational change management practice, as well as part of our organizational transformation services group. We also have a very large data analytics practice, which is also doing AI type work with a number of clients as well. And the last one I would point out is on the right-hand side of the slide. We do have a growing Workday deployment and managed services group. They do Workday ERP implementations as well as what they call AMS support, which is post-go live support for clients that choose to use them for those type of activities. Now, when we do a software selection like we're talking about, it's very important that we stay vendor neutral. So there is a line, if you will, between our Workday practice and our organizational transformation services group, so that we can maintain that vendor neutrality. Personally, I've done Oracle Cloud implementations as well as Workday implementations, so I'm familiar with both. I've also been involved in number of other ERP systems as well over the course of my career. So that's the end of our recap about Avaap. So let's go ahead and move into the content. So we'll start out here with a polling question, the first one. And again, why are you attending today's session is the question. And we've given you several responses there. So let's give it a minute for you to reply back to that, and we'll see where people are at. There's a number of people that are just gathering information, and I'm sure there's others that maybe are considering a selection here in the future. We'll see where we end up. Okay. Well, it looks like a lot of people, actually all the people on the call are gathering information on new selection approaches. Well, that's good to know as we go through the content today. So we'll make sure that we try to address and talk about the selection process in total. All right. Now, as we get started on talking about software selection and doing it from a cloud perspective, one of the things I'll emphasize as we go into this presentation is a lot of the information you're going to see has sort of an ERP slant to it, because that's the examples we're using in today's session. But again, this selection process can be used across any type of system, enterprise type system that you're looking at going for. We've done this for EHRs as well as in the healthcare space. We've done it for, obviously ERP systems as well as, CRM type systems as well. So again, this type of an approach can be used across the board. Now, the key thing when you're doing a selection here is we need to make sure we choose wisely. I think when you look at the slide, I think Gartner had, a lot of information out there recently saying that, the ERP market is continuing to grow. And there's a lot of folks out there, trying to, get new ERP systems or move from their older legacy systems to the new cloud systems that are out there today. So the bottom line is a lot of people are going through this process. And unfortunately, there's a lot of folks that fail in these ERP implementations. And the reasons for that, in our opinion, is they oftentimes don't choose the right system, or maybe when they're going through this process, they're not thinking about it in the right way. So with that as a backdrop, let's talk a little bit about what's changed in the ERP marketplace, over the last decade plus. So we've really come a long way with ERP systems, and what you're seeing on this particular slide is sort of a view of what a legacy ERP system really is focused on and looks like, and what the new cloud systems that are out there are focused on. So a legacy ERP system, traditionally you had, the system, let's say SAP, PeopleSoft, any of those legacy systems that are out there. The bottom line is that you could basically customize those systems to your heart's content. So PeopleSoft had people code underneath the covers, and everybody, when they received it, they made it their own. Now, there's good and bad with that. Obviously, you're meeting a specific requirement that you have in your organization or something that a customer wanted in your organization. It's the reason you made that change. However, the bad thing about making those customizations is every time a new release comes out, you have to re-customize after you've implemented the newest release of the software. And in the higher ed space, Banner, Lucian Banner as an example. I know when I was a CIO, we had that as our core system, and it took upwards of 6 months to a year at times to actually implement the annual release of software because of the number of changes that we had made, or customizations we had made to the system. Well, that actually creates a big issue because you have these elongated release cycles. And the bottom line is that it stretches over time, and you're not getting the use of that key functionality when you'd want to. And oftentimes organizations don't even implement the releases because of the effort that it takes. So they're sort of static on their current functionality. On the cloud side, you really don't have a choice. So at the end of the day, the Oracle Clouds of the world, the Workdays of the world, the bottom line is they have software that the same code set is the same codes that you would use for every one of your clients. So the idea is that the same code is used for everyone. You're not going to go and customize the system because you can't. Now, these systems are very configurable, but they're not customizable. And that's a big difference because, like in Oracle Cloud's case, 4 times a year, every quarter, you get a new release of software. With Workday, every 6 months, you're going to get a new release of software. And you're automatically going to get that software, and it's going to be, in your production environment, within a very short period of time of being released. So you really don't have an opportunity to be behind on releases. And as a result of that, when we implement the systems, again, you don't have that opportunity to just customize to your heart's content. And what we see oftentimes clients doing is they really want to focus on best practice and trying to implement that best practice in their organizations that other clients have implemented successfully, so that they basically are taking advantage of that transformational process that you can do as part of one of these implementations. So the bottom line is, what are the impacts of this new paradigm of the ERP systems, our cloud-based systems that are out there? So the bottom line is, there's really, when you're doing a selection, one of the key things that you want to do is develop requirements. Okay. However, it's interesting because with the new systems, really we want to focus on what you do, not necessarily how you do it. Okay, because again, the idea of these new cloud-based systems is they're focusing on vendor best practice business processes. And again, 95% of the time, you can bring in vendor best practices and it's not going to be any issues for an organization to go with that. For example, if how you do a journal entry in your financial systems, as an example, or anything like that, it really doesn't matter. There's no strategic advantage for you to basically do it different than any other organization. And again, 95% of the time, those business processes that you bring in, as long as they're there and you can do them, you should be fine. And it actually gives you an opportunity to move to a best practice, whereas you may not have had best practice historically in your organization. However, there is maybe those 5% that are strategic, if you will. And those you certainly have the ability to configure these systems. And that's really where you want to spend your time. But when we're developing requirements for a selection, again, what we're going to focus on is what you do. So which business processes, which functionality do you actually need instead of how it's being done today? If you wanted to replicate your current business processes, the bottom line is you probably wouldn't be looking for a new system. Now, the next thing that you do, and next implication here is functional versus technical leadership. So because these systems are sort of pre-built, if you will, and they come with oftentimes what we call recipes that they bring in when you first implement these systems. The bottom line is when you're doing an implementation, you'll see right away that most of these systems, or actually all these cloud-based systems, are implemented in an iterative manner. So in other words, what happens is they quickly want you to see the software and for your functional teams to interact with it, to give feedback and update the configuration accordingly. Whereas previously, what used to happen is you would go in and as an implementer, we would go in and basically say, hey, what are your requirements, for this particular business process? We would gather all that information. And the bottom line is we would build it. And then 6 months later, you would actually see the system for the first time. And that's not the way these new implementations work. So as a result of that, the functional teams are significantly engaged right out of the gate. And we want to make sure that in a selection process, we basically do the same thing. These are not technically driven projects for the most part. They're going to be functionally driven, and your selection process should be the same way. The third implication of this new approach towards selections and the new paradigm, if you will, of cloud solutions for these systems is that avoidance versus adoption. So in other words, if you had a resistor in your organization, someone that really didn't want to adopt, the way, comes a new system, or basically a system is utilized by other organizations. In the past, what you would do is you would sort of avoid that difficult conversation and actually customize the system to meet a specific need. Well, again, because you can't customize these systems, you can configure them, but you can't customize them. What we see a lot of times is the organizational change management, getting people to understand why they need to change and why they need to do things differently becomes paramount in these implementations. And again, in our selection process, which we're going to show you shortly, we've actually included organizational change management right out of the gate into the process so that they can actually start working through and getting people used to, here's what's going to happen with this new cloud-based paradigm, of systems that are out there. And then the last thing I'll point out with this new paradigm is theoretical versus known. Again, if you put a system in, like let's say a PeopleSoft, and you customize it to meet your specific requirements, the bottom line is that your instance of PeopleSoft is going to be different than another organization's or institution's, instance of PeopleSoft. So as a result, the success or the benefits you get may be very different as well. When you're dealing with an Oracle Cloud or a Workday or systems like that, the bottom line is that because you're using the same code set and you're using the same functionality across all the clients, you can basically say, okay, because this organization or institution has done X with it, we can also then, based upon our numbers, if you number of people, number of business processes, whatever, based on our numbers, we can actually model what success you're going to get with this new system as well. So instead of being theoretical, we can actually make it very known the benefits you could potentially get with a new system as you go through this process. So again, that's the impacts, if you will, of the new approach, of actually, new systems that are out there and the cloud-based systems that are out there today. Okay. So let's go ahead and get another polling question. In your opinion, what is most important when selecting a new system? Is it selecting a system that maintains current functionality? Is it selecting a system that utilizes newer technologies? Or is it selecting a system that utilizes technology to basically increase business efficiency and effectiveness? Is it a combination of those? So let's give it a minute here and see what people think for that particular question. And as expected, everybody basically responded that selecting a system that utilizes technology to increase business efficiency and effectiveness is really what they're trying to achieve. And I think that's always been the case out there. But I think what's really happened over time is sometimes, again, I sit in a CIO chair. You don't want to basically implement something just to get new technology. And from a CHR or CFO's perspective, you don't want to implement something just to continue to do what you're doing today. You want to basically be better when you're putting the kind of money that you're putting into new systems. You want to make sure that it makes a difference in your organization moving forward. So with that as a backdrop, let's talk about Avaap's unique selection approach for a cloud-based systems. Okay. Now, why is our selection process unique? So we're going to be talking about each one of these particular stages distinctly, but the big difference between what we have done today and the selection processes of yesteryears, so to speak, really starts in that first stage we call organizational alignment. So it used to be that organizations did what they call fit gaps. And with a fit gap analysis, really what you're doing is you're going back and taking a look at everything you do today, mapping it all out, and generating your requirements based upon, what you're doing in today's world. Okay. What we're doing with organizational alignment is saying, based upon how other organizations have utilized the software you're looking at moving to, what we want to do is create a vision with you, have you create a vision with our facilitation of what the future looks like with this particular software, and then create the requirements based upon, that future vision, if you will, instead of looking back into the past. So once that organizational alignment is done, that's stage one, then we can basically generate all those requirements based on that future vision, which drives the rest of the process. So again, requests for proposals, vendor analysis and recommendations are pretty common out there with most software selections, even in the past. But we drive that with this organizational alignment process, if you will, that we start the process out with. Now, the other distinguishing factor that I would say about Avaap's process is our business case development. Now, the business case development, as you see here, is the typical thing you would see creating a business case. We want to develop a TCO. We want a strategic overview of what we're doing, solutions overview. It's basically showing why we're moving, to this new software and the benefits it's going to give us, the cost it's going to have, et cetera. A typical business case. Now, every organization may have a different format for their business case, and we can certainly meld to what a particular organization is trying to do. But the bottom line is that business case development is vital. And the difference that we have is we've actually developed workbooks behind the scenes based on what we call value assessments done with implementing cloud-based software. So remember when we said before that one of the things you can do is you can be very sure of what you're going to get with these cloud systems because you're not changing the code sets. You can take what other people have done and model that back to yourselves. So no longer are we sitting there guessing, at possible benefits. We can say, that these particular benefits have been achieved by customers that have went before you. Let's model that based upon your organizational stats and actually give you real world, here's what your benefits are going to be as part of your TCO. And then the last thing is negotiating and contracting. Again, a very standard process of any type of selection. And we'll talk about that in more detail and what we do there as we move forward. So that's in general our selection approach that's basically built for the cloud. So let's dive a little bit into the process. So one of the things that we have on the top of that selection process is what we call enterprise program management. And again, this is very common for all selections, past and present. But one thing we wanted to emphasize is that the thing I think that we can bring to the table here is Avaap, and I think something you really need is basically experience with implementing the systems that you could potentially be looking at. So oftentimes we see organizations choosing someone for their selection processes that don't know the software. And at that point, it's really the process is more just a structured, running through a selection process, but they're not adding the selection person helping you or facilitating the work isn't necessarily adding value add, saying what these systems can do and not do, and helping you with what you may or may not know with these future systems. And that's extremely important. And it's one reason we wanted to show this particular slide is because the bottom line is you want to make sure that you partner with someone through the cloud-based software selection that has done these selections and implementations historically, so they can actually help you with the things that you don't know. For example, one of the activities that we often do in our organizational alignment process is something called a solution context whiteboarding session. Now, what that really means is we basically are asking each person in the organization that's participating in that activity, we're saying, okay, what systems do you use today? And we document all your systems that you're using, but it's not just a documentation exercise. Based upon our experience implementing and selecting these systems historically, we can tell you the disposition of what could happen with these cloud-based systems. In other words, we had one client that 100 and I think it was 36 systems that they had and were utilizing, and they were looking for a new ERP system, and they could actually replace 78 of those systems with their new ERP. Now, you wouldn't have known that unless someone had implemented those systems historically and can give you firsthand feedback to say these systems have this particular functionality, which you may not have in your ERP system today. So again, that's something that's very important as you go through an implementation, partnering with people that know these systems, okay? So now let's get into that first stage, organizational alignment. Now, organizational alignment really is ideas beginning with the end in mind, okay? So the bottom line is our approach is we're going to basically go through and make sure, that we get a clear vision for what you want to do going forward in the future, as we said before. And it really doesn't matter how big or how small the organization is that we're working with. It's the same basic process. Now, again, the scope of the software you're looking for may be a little different based on the size of your organization, but this approach can be used for large organizations and small. But the idea here is we want to achieve consensus as we go through this process and say, let's discover what you do, let's debate, let's decide what that future looks like and document it. So then moving forward with the rest of the selection process, we have a firm idea of where we want to go. Now, the stages in organizational alignment is really that discovery, defining what the project would look like in the future, or that software that's needed, planning out what it would look like when you actually would implement something. Now, why do you want to think about that? You want to make sure that you understand how the system's going to integrate with the rest of your system portfolio. You want to understand what possible roadmaps are out there for implementing the system. So when you actually go out with your RFP, you can actually specify those things distinctly. One of the things that's interesting with, and again, I'll use the example of an ERP software package. With our ERP software packages, it's interesting that, when you get an RFP out there, if you don't specify, I want, an implementation of, 18 months or something like that, what will happen is there'll be games played by people responding, and they'll try to make it a minimum type of implementation possible to win the deal, but it may be unrealistic for you to actually do that implementation at that time. And then a change orders come afterward, that ends up costing more for the institution or the organization. So you want to be very specific so you can compare all the vendors, A and B, with the same type of, requirements, whether it be for the software or whether it be for the implementation. And again, one thing we do through this process is what we're going to take is your strategic initiatives, map them to objectives, map them to success factors, and that's going to drive the rest of the process. Now, one thing we also wanted to show, is that, we really start with those strategic intents of what you're trying to do. Now, again, this is a client example of, what their strategic intents were for a new ERP system. So again, if you look through this list, and depending on what system you're looking for, if you are looking for an ERP, you may look through this and say, okay, a lot of these apply to us as an organization as well. And one of the things that we do through our alignment is we don't just start from scratch in the process. Because we've done this so many times, we're able to actually work with a client and say, okay, hey, these are the strategic intents from 2 or 3 other organizations. Let's tweak one of these or tweak these to basically work for you. So you're never basically starting from scratch. When we're looking at vision statements, you look at vision and statements of other organizations. If you're looking at what benefits can I achieve, with this, we're actually looking at that and what other organizations have achieved and said what applies to us. So again, because you're starting from a template and you're never starting from scratch, that allows us to get through this information very quickly. In a 4 to 6 week time frame, we can get through an organizational alignment and get you started on a selection process, which basically streamlines that process overall. Now let's talk about stage 2. Once we actually have the organizational alignment and we have that clear vision for the future, the next thing that we're going to want to do is we want clear and concise, RFP developed to solicit the best responses. Now, if you've ever seen, RFPs being produced, and again, depending on which side of the fence you've sat on historically, having been a former CIO, I've seen a lot of RFP responses that were actually, to be blunt, very terrible. Okay. And oftentimes when you look at that, sometimes it's just the vendor or whatever didn't know what they were doing. But oftentimes what happens is that we weren't specific enough in our RFPs. So a good RFP is going to solicit good responses. Now, that isn't always the case, but that is a big culprit a lot of times. If it's confusing, you're going to get a confusing response. So what we try to do is make sure that we have a clear, concise RFP that leaves nothing to question, okay, so that you can actually solicit the best responses possible for your organization. Now, before we actually issue the RFP, one of the other things that we'll want to do with your selection team is actually figure out how are we going to grade these RFPs when we get the responses back. Now, it's very important, okay, that you do this before you send out the RFP, because you don't want to, have this variable process where, you're introducing selection criteria or, evaluation criteria after the fact. You want to make sure that you're looking at it, up front, and that everybody is on the same page. And again, we usually include this, how we're going to grade in the RFP, so there's nothing left to chance or no one's confused about what's important to the institution or the organization. So again, as you see over here, there's certain criteria, ability to meet requirements, which is typical, product presentations and demonstrations, which is part of usually the stage 2, if you will, once someone gets down selected. Tech architecture, is something we look at as part of the proposal. And that's important because I think in the cloud world, a lot of people use confusing languages to basically, talk about their systems, but under the covers, they really may not be a true cloud type architecture. It may just be a hosted architecture, and they move their traditional legacy system to a hosted environment, and they really don't have necessarily the benefits that you would get from a true cloud system. Like a Salesforce, or something like that, that's a true cloud architecture. So again, we would dig into the detail underneath each of these scoring evaluation criteria. You have hundreds of specific criteria you analyzing to result in, for example, those 20 points for requirements. And we've given an example here on the right. I think with a typical ERP implementation, let's assume that it's going to be what they call platform, which is HR, payroll, finance, procurement. In those type of situations, you're talking upwards of 550 evaluation criteria. And there's actually around 500 business processes in a standard ERP system. If you add student to that in the higher ed, you would also add an additional 250 to 300 additional business processes. So you could be dealing with 800 specific requirements, that you're utilizing to evaluate that ability to meet requirements in that 20 points. So there's a lot of detail behind each of these selection criteria. But again, we'll talk about all of this, prior to the RFP, being issued as part of that RFP development process. Okay. And it's very important that that happens. Now, stage three. Stage three, we call analysis and recommendations. And again, what you're going to see here is basically an 8-step process to basically evaluate proposals that it came in as a response to an RFP or a proposal request. And again, I will emphasize in stage two, sometimes organizations, depending upon their ability to do this, and government organizations, you don't often have the ability to be this flexible. But in some cases in higher ed, we've seen organizations that have said, I know there's only 2 or 3 clear players that are out there that continue to win this type of work. Can we just solicit proposals from those specific organizations rather than doing a formal RFP? And we certainly can support that as well. We would do a proposal request in that case to those specific vendors so we can get their responses back and work through this process in that manner rather than a formal RFP. But we can do it both ways. Okay, now in stage three, what you want to do is, again, I won't read through all this, but what you're trying to do is work through this 8-step process. Now, once you've actually done stage 1 and 2, you oftentimes down select the vendors to a short list. And then with that short list of vendors, 2 or 3, you would then do steps 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7 and 8. That's the rest of the process, if you will. Now, it is emphasized here, number 5, develop total cost of ownership. It is important that we do that at a cursory level. Now, the business case, again, is another stage, but what we want to do, at least at a minimum, is actually figure out, what is the, the total cost of ownership from a capital cost, operating cost, and also projected benefits. We want to make sure that's part of the evaluation process. If you actually just analyze cost and don't look at benefits, oftentimes you can come to the wrong decisions, because in a cloud world, these vendors are significantly different in their architecture and the benefits they could potentially provide. So that's extremely important, and the reason is emphasized there. All right, so let's know our next polling question. What has been your experience when presenting business benefits for a new system to an executive sponsor? So let's go ahead and read through those, and I'll give you a minute to take a look at that as before we continue with this webinar. Documented business benefits are scrutinized and rarely accepted by key executives, which is something that quite often happens. And we wanted to basically have this polling question before we dug into the detail of our business case for that very reason, because a lot of times the reason that these business benefits are scrutinized and rarely accepted is because they have no background. In other words, they're just guesses. So let's talk about that a little bit. All right. So if we go to, again, we're in that step 3 analysis and recommendations, but we're actually looking at that total cost of ownership calculations. Capital costs and documenting those, if you're working with someone that has done these implementations or selections in the past, we have workbooks that we've developed that have all the potential capital costs that are involved with, implementing, systems. We also can share pretty readily the changes in operating costs, for these new systems as well. And that includes, ongoing support, et cetera, because the support models for these systems often change, as you implement it. It requires different things. For example, again, using the ERP theme, the bottom line is a lot of these systems have pervasive employ and manage your self-service functionality. So because of that, you're going to get less people doing manual forms in HR, as an example, than you would historically, because they're able to do those things, directly in the system. So as a result, staffing or things that people that have been doing something historically in those areas may be able to utilize in more strategic, areas going forward in the future. Well, those shifts in support, it's important to capture that in your updated operating model, as an example. Now, that's basically the capital and operating. That's pretty typical for capturing that for these type of implementations. The thing, again, that is different, and the last polling question sort of highlighted that, is the potential savings. A lot of times, executives will see those potential savings and say, that's not going to happen in our organization, or how can you basically calculate that? So again, what we've done is we've taken value assessments that have been done by the vendors and by ourselves, post implementation of these systems, and we've taken that information over numerous clients and said, okay, if we get X% benefit, from implementing this particular functionality, and we have this type of cost for your particular organization for that activity, we can show you, what those benefits are going to be, or potential savings are going to be for your organization. And oftentimes, again, we have to explain that to our executive groups. We have to explain that, and work through those models with your selection team. But the bottom line is they're no longer just fuzzy little things that are out there that are guesses. They're actual savings that are modeled based upon value assessments done from people who have done the same type of implementations that you've done historically, when you've done them, when other organizations have done them in the past. And that's a big difference, with the new cloud systems, and again, with our methodology in general. So let's go to stage 4, business case development. Now, with that information, again, we did the TCO as part of the evaluation because we wanted to make sure we analyzed cost. However, when we get to the business case, what we oftentimes do is we're actually going to create what we call a deck or a presentation. Oftentimes, it's based upon each organization or institution's model, or what their board and or key decision makers are used to seeing. And we'll take all that information from alignment, from our analysis process, from the TCO and the costs, and we're going to basically build that into a presentation, a story, if you will, that actually shows what's going to be done over time, with this implementation. And again, all the things you see under that key components of business cases are always included. We just typically use the format that an organization or institution is used to seeing things in. But the bottom line is it's really key that these business cases be developed, and you do this before you actually go into negotiations and contracting, because you want to make sure when you get into negotiations and contracting, you're not going to negotiate with someone and say, well, let me take it back and see if we can afford that. You want to know what you can do and what you can't do. And as a result of that, then when you're in negotiations and contracting, you can be much better at negotiating a best deal for your organization or institution, when you're getting into that stage. So getting through this business case is vital before we do negotiation and contracting. Oftentimes organizations say, okay, I've already done a business case before this process started, but we'd want to update it with the cost information that we've done or we've come up with to make sure it still is sound, if you will. Oftentimes organizations, you know, um, do things in a different way, and we can certainly flex to that. But again, the key here is we want to make sure we understand what's possible before we go into negotiation and contracting so we can negotiate the best deal possible for your organization or institution. All right, so let's go to stage 5, negotiation and contracting. Now, there's really two stages, two phases, I guess, to negotiate to that negotiation and contracting stage. Phase 1 is what we'll call critical strategic requirements. In other words, let's say you have 3 vendors you're considering, and your team really likes vendor A, but one thing that's really concerning to them is X. They have one thing that, if we can't get that resolved, then we probably are going to go to our second vendor. Well, if that's the case, that becomes one of those strategic requirements, and it's immediate focus during the negotiations that we really need to focus in on this issue. Can you basically adjust, or can you be flexible in this area? Can we come to a solution that's, beneficial for the organization or institution in this particular area of concern? If not, then we would probably go to the secondary vendor in the selection process. That's what we call strategic negotiations. We're resolving issues that are vital to get a deal done. Now, phase 2 is what we call tactical negotiations, and that really comes down to the legal T's and C's, in many cases, business terms and conditions. If you're dealing, again, with an ERP system and you're dealing with the implementation vendors that are out there, it may also include looking at the SOW, working through all of the different criteria in each functional area. There's a lot to it, okay? But it's involving, each of the areas you see here, going through all of the documentation, making sure we understand, our point of view as an organization, and then we negotiate the best possible contract, for the organization. And oftentimes what we do is we go through and negotiate all the T's and C's and the business terms and conditions before we ask for the BAFO. And the reason for that is because we want to make sure that we're getting everything included that should be included, so we went through all that detail, and then we're getting that best and final offer and driving toward that final contract. Okay. So that's what we call negotiation and contracting, or stage 5, of our process. Now, we also wanted to give a high level view, if you will, of what this software selection timeline might look like. So again, we talked about these stages: organizational alignment, proposal creation or RFP creation, vendor analysis and recommendations, business case development, and negotiation and contracting. In total, we can do this, and we have done this pretty consistently, over a 28-week time frame, or 6 to 7 months. Okay. Now, for some folks, that may seem very short, but again, what we can do with the organizational alignment in a 4 to 6 week period, because we have all this wealth of information from previous systems, we can actually come in and say, hey, this is what others have done. Let's help you create a vision for the future in a very short period of time. Once that's done, that drives the rest of the process: proposal creation, vendor analysis and recommendation, etc. And under vendor analysis and recommendations, you'll see we have some sub-processes in here. The vendor proposals, you have to give people time to respond to the RFP. That's oftentimes this area of vendor analysis and recommendation is the long pole in the tent, so to speak. So you have to give people time to respond. Once they've responded, we need time to evaluate, then conduct the demos and presentations. Then we need to do reference calls. Sometimes you can overlap some of these activities, and then vendor solution recommendations basically after that. But in total, when we're looking at this, after business case and negotiation, 4 to 6 week for negotiation, again, we're looking at a 28-week type timeline. Now, if you would choose to have a longer time frame because you want to give people more time to respond, or there's certain requirements the organization would have, that certainly can be adjusted. But again, our baseline is typically 28 weeks for a typical cloud-based system selection. Okay. Now, let's switch gears a little bit. And one of the things that often happens during our organizational alignment process is we actually identify things that could potentially be concerns when they would basically implement a system. And as a result of that, if we highlight those things, there's oftentimes implementation preparation activities that folks can do, in between the selection and implementation, or maybe in parallel with the selection process to get themselves ready, for that future system implementation. And again, I won't read through all these, but let me take, maybe a couple of them just to highlight what we're talking about. So security. Oftentimes, access control and identity management infrastructure comes up when we're talking to folks about, a new cloud-based system. Now, why, you would say? Well, most organizations use Active Directory. And if their Active Directory is actually in a data center on site, on premise, what you're actually doing if you're using a new cloud-based system is you're linking that cloud-based system to access control that's actually on premise. So if something happens to your on-premise system, you can't get to your cloud-based system. Well, that's really not something you want to be doing, when you actually go to a cloud type infrastructure for a new cloud-based system. So you want to look at moving, that to a cloud-based type architecture. So it's not dependent, upon an on-premise architecture you've had in the past. So again, things like that come up during that organizational alignment process. We identify them, and then folks can start working on them. And again, the next one, data. Oftentimes, and again, I'll use the ERP example again. If you're moving to a new ERP system, let's say you've used your current system for 25, 30 years. The bottom line is that, you have a lot of data in that old system, but you really don't want to necessarily bring all the data into your new system. And there's a reason why. Because if you're transforming your organization into a new operating model, new way of doing things, the bottom line is you would probably want to bring all your active data and financials. Let's say you may want to bring in 2 years of history so you can do, year-over-year financial reporting right out of the gate. But you don't want to have to bring in data that's 20 years old and rebuild the environment, if you will, in your new system that created that old data in the first place. So in other words, there may be cost centers 20 years ago that don't exist today. Why would you want to build that in your new system? So typically we recommend you bring a minimum amount of data into your new system to get things started. Active data, active purchase orders, active invoices, those type of things. 2 years of summarized financials so you can do month-over-month reporting, those type of things. But then the question comes up, well, what do we do with this other data? We want to turn off that old system. Well, that's when we have a conversation about the options around that. Do you have a data warehouse, a data mart, a data lake that you can put this data in, and report off it for compliance type reporting in HR or something like that? Should we look at an archiving solution? Or do we have to look, depending on the system selected, they may have, a data type mart that you can basically bring data into, that's, better than bringing it into maybe the system itself. So again, those type of discussions can happen, if we understand the environment you're in today and what needs to occur. And again, I won't read through this full list, but it's basically similar, right? Going down maybe to the governance. Obviously we're going to have a governance structure that we talk about in organizational alignment. This is what you need to be successful in this. We've been talking ERP. For an ERP implementation, this is what your governance structure needs to look like. Well, maybe you've struggled in governance historically within your organization or institution. This can be a model that you can utilize for all systems going forward, and all, transformational projects going forward, rather than just this one. So again, this is a discussion around, how can we take what we're doing here and utilize it for the entire institution, maybe going forward into the future. So again, all of these things are things you want to consider, and will come up during that organizational alignment stage as we vision what that future looks like together. Okay. So in review, a few things that we want to highlight. First of all, begin with the end in mind. That's that organizational alignment stage is key to a software selection. And it's important that we have that clear vision for where we want to go in the future. Business transformation, we really need to focus on what instead of how. With the new cloud-based systems, you have a lot of opportunity to transform your organization to a new way of doing things. If you focus on what you do today and do fit gaps, and document your current business processes, and you go to that new system, a lot of times those things are going in the trash. So you're wasting your money. So we really focus on the what instead of the how. And then the process is important as the selection. So in other words, you're going to get bad results if you have a bad process. And oftentimes people have failures because they didn't consider X, Y, or Z. And making sure you have, experienced partners that are software experts that have done these implementation selections in the past will ensure that you have a process that fits what you're trying to do. Okay. So in conclusion, that's sort of what that new cloud-based software selection looks like. And at this point, I think we're ready for any questions that folks may have.
Thank you so much, Tim. Your first question is, how are requirements developed for a new system without documenting current business processes?
Okay. So in the organizational alignment process, we actually sort of help you envision what that future looks like. And oftentimes we understand, again, that what you're doing. Oftentimes we'll look at things from a business process perspective. So for example, we need to make sure that we can do a general ledger transaction. Well, the requirement ends up becoming ability to perform general ledger, loads or general ledger transactions. So again, all those business processes, 800 plus for a standard ERP system, can be easily turned into requirements, and that will allow you to easily compare the vendors and what functionality they can give you, rather than looking in the past and actually mapping your requirements based upon what you do today. So that's how we usually come up with the requirements. Those business processes, we understand what we're going to try to accomplish, what things are in scope, and that drives those requirements that are generated. Now, things that aren't BP related, like there's a lot of times in payroll as an example, it's not maybe a BP heavy area, but it is a lot of calculation and, calcs that have to happen, et cetera. Those things would be documented as key functional areas or functionality that's needed. And again, those will turn into requirements as well. And that's all part of that future vision that you would help create.
Thank you, Tim. Your next question is, can a business case be developed prior to issuing an RFP to make sure funding is available before starting the actual selection process?
That's a really good question. So let me go back and actually show our process. So again, we typically have business case development slated right here as stage 4, but oftentimes we have clients that say, okay, before we actually start the RFP, we want to make sure that we have the funding and everything ready. So we can actually move the business case stage 4 to stage 2, if you will, bring it right after organizational alignment. So we can do that work before we start the RFP process. Now, again, what you want to do is you want to update that business case once you get the actual numbers from each of the vendors. But it is pretty common that we actually do a business case right after organizational alignment for many institutions. And actually, we've had some organizations that said, okay, hey, we don't want to do a full RFP process at this point, but we want to do an assessment of our ERP system or a system that are out there. So in other words, what we want to do is we want to do the organizational alignment. We want to develop a business case Once we get approval, and it could be 3, 6 months later, then we can start that RFP, vendor analysis and negotiation and contracting process. So again, this is very flexible depending upon the needs of the organization or the institution we're working with.
Thank you, Tim. The next question reads, should software implementation be included in a software selection RFP?
And that really depends upon the software we're looking at. We've been dealing with, an ERP type example for most of this discussion. And in that case, the implementation vendors in many cases are quite distinct, from the actual, vendor that has the software. For example, Oracle Cloud has a number, Oracle has a number of, partners that implement the Oracle Cloud system. Same thing with Workday. They have a number of, partners that implement the systems for them. And oftentimes what we see is in those cases, when you have sort of those two entities working together to get you where you need to go, in those particular situations, sometimes the software vendor's pressure is probably the best way to put it. The implementation vendors to have a minimal price out there so that they can try to win the deal. Well, as a result, you may get a suboptimal implementation because they're not really focused on what's best for you, but best for the software company trying to win the deal. So, and again, we have different organizations depending on your priorities that choose to do this differently. Recently, we had one organization, they wanted to include the implementation in the software selection because time was paramount. Okay. And in that particular case, we did it together. And we tried to make sure, and this was actually an ERP system, we made sure that the software vendors were bringing folks in, and we had 3 options that they had to bring in, and we make sure we laid everything out of what the timeframes were, everything, so we couldn't do the games of, a minimal implementation so they could win a deal. They had to adhere to the specific requirements we were putting out there. There's some software packages, so oftentimes CRMs as an example, that the software vendors actually do the implementations as well. And in those particular cases, obviously they're all together all the time. But again, for a larger system like an EHR or in healthcare or for a ERP, you have the option of doing them together if time is of the essence. But our recommendation is oftentimes let's select the software and then select the implementation partner distinctly after you've selected the software, so that you can, get the best possible solution for your organization if time is not as critical. Okay.
Thank you so much, Tim. Your last question for today is, do you include organizational change management resources in your software selection process?
Yes, we do. And there's a real big reason for that. We talked about the fact that organizational alignment is a key part of an implementation. Well, one of the things we want to do right out of the gate in organizational alignment is introduce that OCM component and make sure when we're talking about that future vision that we actually include those OCM activities and get people used to what does OCM mean? Why is it so vital? Getting people used to what's required there and what's going to be part of the future implementation so we can actually start talking about transformation right away rather than waiting for the actual implementation to happen. So typically our OCM team is involved in alignment and then they're not as involved in the rest of that selection process until we actually get to, an implementation itself. But they are definitely involved in the organizational alignment process of our selection approach.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Tim. I'd like to thank our participants as well as our speaker for being with us today. We hope the information you received during this webinar has been helpful to you and your organization. Everyone will receive a recording of the presentation in a follow-up email. Thank you for attending this webinar today. Please don't hesitate to call or email us with any questions.